My father-in-law laughed in my face and told me I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight his son. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're right." What he didn't know was that I'd already made one phone call and the man on the other end of that line was about to walk into a courtroom and take everything Richard Porter thought he owned. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really began 18 years ago in a life I built on silence. My name is Cassidy Porter and for 18 years I was married to a man named Ethan and for 18 years I let his family believe I came from nothing. That wasn't an accident, it was a choice and it was mine. I'm a major in the United States Army. I've spent my adult life following orders and giving them, learning that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. I learned discipline before I learned how to fall in love. And somewhere along the way that discipline became the only armor I had left in a marriage that slowly stopped being about me. We lived comfortably, not extravagantly. I never wanted extravagant, but comfortably on a combined income that let us keep a modest colonial house outside of Richmond. 2 cars in the driveway and a kitchen where I used to make dinner every night. I wasn't deployed. I never once mentioned my maiden name meant anything. I never brought it up at Thanksgiving, never corrected anyone at a holiday party, never so much as hinted that there was a version of my life Richard Porter knew nothing about. Richard is my father-in-law. 71 years old, retired now, though retired is a generous word for a man who still calls the office 4 times a day to make sure nobody forgets whose name is on the building. He built a shipping logistics company from a single truck in 1979 into something worth more than most people will see in 3 lifetimes. And somewhere in that climb, he decided that money wasn't just a tool. It was proof that he was smarter, harder, better than the people around him. And in his mind, I was never one of the better people. He said it to me more than once, always with that same easy-cutting smile. "Your family doesn't have much, does it, Cassidy?" He'd say it at dinner in front of Ethan, in front of his golf buddies, like it was a fact as plain as the weather. And every single time I smiled back and let it go, people assume that kind of silence means weakness. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is just patience wearing a disguise. I want to be honest with you about something else, too. Because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was some kind of saint standing quietly in the corner while the world underestimated me. There were nights I went to bed feeling smaller than I actually was. There were nights I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror after Richard's dinner parties and wondered when exactly I'd agreed to shrink myself to fit inside his idea of what a Porter wife should be. I loved Ethan once. I want that understood. I loved the version of him I met when we were 24. The one who used to drive 4 hours just to watch me graduate from officer training. Who actually cried the day I told him I was coming home safe from my first deployment. That man existed. I promise you he did. But somewhere between his father's money and his own ambition, that man started disappearing, replaced by someone who wore expensive suits and started believing his own reflection a little too much. The affair wasn't a single moment of discovery. It was death by 1,000 small cuts of perfume that wasn't mine on his jacket. A phone he started angling away from me at dinner. A business trip to Chicago that somehow required 4 days instead of 2. Her name was Melissa Grant. 29 years old, worked in his company's marketing division. The kind of woman who laughed a little too loud at things that weren't funny, specifically when she knew I was in the room. I found out for certain on a Tuesday in March, standing in our kitchen with my phone in my hand, staring at a text message that had been sent to the wrong contact. 6 words. 6 words that ended 18 years in the time it takes to read a sentence. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I stood there in my socked feet on the cold tile floor and felt something in my chest go very, very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm hits. What broke me more than the affair itself was what came after, the day I learned that Richard already knew, had known for months, and instead of saying anything to me, instead of showing even a flicker of decency toward the woman who'd sat at his table every Sunday for almost 2 decades, he'd looked his son in the eye and said, "Successful men have needs, Ethan. Just be smarter about it next time. Not stop. Not, you're breaking your family. Just be smarter." I heard about that conversation secondhand from Ethan's own sister, who thought I already knew and let it slip over coffee like it was nothing. I remember setting my cup down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't steady enough to trust yourself. That was the moment I stopped being surprised by anything the Porter family did. And it was the moment I started paying very, very close attention. 3 weeks later, I found the folder. It was sitting in Ethan's home office, tucked inside a drawer he usually kept locked, left open because he'd been in a hurry that morning. Divorce paperwork already drafted, already reviewed by his father's personal attorney, no less, outlining exactly how he intended to walk away with the house, the investment accounts, the cars, all of it, while I was left with what his filing generously called reasonable transitional support. I stood in that office for a long time holding pages that had been written about my life without me in the room. And here's the thing, nobody in that family understood about me yet. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even particularly angry. Not in the way you'd expect. What I felt standing there with those papers in my hand was something closer to clarity. The same cold, focused clarity I used to feel in the field right before executing a plan I'd already run through 100 times in my head because they didn't know who I really was. Not fully. Not the part of me I'd kept folded away for 18 years, like a photograph I never showed anyone. They didn't know about my brother. Richard called me 2 days after I found those divorce papers, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident he was that I hadn't found anything at all. He didn't call to check on me. He called to arrange a meeting. And he chose the location himself, a coffee shop near his office, the kind of place with exposed brick and $8 lattes, the kind of place where he liked to conduct business because it made him feel like he was still the man calling the shots in every room he entered. I got there first. I always get there first. It's a habit from the army that never left me control the terrain before anyone else arrives. Richard walked in wearing his charcoal overcoat, the one he wore whenever he wanted to remind you he could afford better than you, and he sat down across from me without asking how I was doing, without a single word of acknowledgement that his son had spent the better part of a year sleeping with someone half his age. He set his coffee down on the table between us with a small deliberate clink, like he was setting the terms of the conversation before he'd even opened his mouth. "Cassidy," he said, folding his hands. "I think it's time we talked like adults." I said, "Nothing." I found that silence is the fastest way to make certain men fill a room with exactly the truth they intend to hide. "Ethan's filed for divorce." He continued, watching my face for a reaction I didn't give him. "I know that's difficult to hear, but I want you to understand something. And I say this because I actually do care about you. You're not going to win this fight, and I'd rather you save yourself the humiliation." "The humiliation," I repeated. "The house stays with Ethan. It was purchased with a down payment from my company, so it's protected. The investment accounts, same thing, structured years ago, long before you two were even engaged to keep family assets separate. The cars are leased under the business." He listed it off like a grocery list, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror that morning, maybe more than once. "You'll receive a reasonable transitional support payment. That's more than fair, considering the circumstances." "Considering what circumstances?" I asked, and for the first time, something in my voice must have carried an edge because he actually paused. "Considering that this marriage has clearly run its course," he said carefully, recovering. "These things happen. Ethan's a good provider. He'll do right by you financially within reason." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the Thanksgivings I'd spent smiling politely while he made comments about where I came from. I thought about the conversation his own daughter had let slip over coffee. "Successful men have needs. Just be smarter next time." I thought about 18 years of folding myself smaller and smaller to fit inside a family that had already decided long before I ever raised my voice that I didn't belong there. And then Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and delivered the line I think he'd been waiting to say from the moment he sat down. "Let's be honest with each other, Cassidy. You can't afford a lawyer capable of fighting my son. Not the kind of lawyer this would require. My legal team has handled matters far more complicated than this, and they will bury anyone you bring in. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's simply true." He smiled after he said it. Not a cruel smile, exactly worse than that. A satisfied one. The smile of a man who believed he'd just done me a kindness by explaining the natural order of the world to someone too naive to already understand it. I felt something settle inside my chest. Quiet and still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "You're right," I said. Richard blinked. Whatever reaction he'd braced for, that clearly wasn't it. He'd expected tears, maybe anger, maybe pleading. He hadn't expected agreement, and for one brief second, something flickered behind his eyes that almost looked like uncertainty. But he recovered fast. Men like Richard always recover fast because they've spent their whole lives being told they're the smartest person in whatever room they occupy, and doubt doesn't have anywhere comfortable to sit in a mind like that. "I'm glad you understand," he said, reaching for his coffee, satisfaction settling back into his shoulders. "I know this is difficult, but I do think in time you'll see this was for the best." I didn't argue. I signed the acknowledgement of service papers he'd brought with him right there at that little table with the exposed brick behind us. And I watched him watch me sign them. Watched the small private triumph move across his face like weather crossing a field. He thought he'd won something. He thought the woman across the table from him had just quietly accepted defeat the same way he probably assumed every woman who'd ever sat across from him eventually did. He had no idea what he'd just done. That night, I sat alone in my car. In the driveway of the house I wasn't sure I'd get to keep, and I made one phone call. Just one. My hands were steady, which surprised me a little given everything. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring, familiar in a way that settled something old and worn down inside my chest. "Well," he said before I'd even gotten a full sentence out. "Took you long enough to call me back?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I'm finally ready. Tell me everything." I did. All of it. The affair. The hidden asset structuring Richard's little speech about lawyers. I couldn't afford every smug word of it. There was a long pause on the other end when I finished, the kind of pause I recognized from childhood. The pause that meant he was already 3 steps ahead of me, already building something in his mind that I couldn't yet see the shape of. "Cassidy," he finally said, and I could hear the change in his voice. Something sharpening underneath the calm. "I need you to trust me completely on this. Don't hire anyone. Don't sign anything else without me seeing it first. And whatever you do, don't tell them who I am." Not yet. I didn't tell him, he didn't need to ask. I'd been keeping that secret for 18 years. What was a few more weeks? Word travels fast in a family like the Porters. And within a week, it seemed like every relative, every family friend, every person who'd ever shaken Richard's hand at a charity gala knew the story he wanted them to know. Cassidy couldn't afford real representation. Cassidy was going to try to fight this alone, or worse, with some overworked public defender types who handled uncontested divorces and nothing more. Cassidy, bless her heart, simply didn't understand what she was up against. I heard it secondhand, the way I heard most things about myself in that family, filtered through someone who thought they were doing me a favor by warning me. Ethan's cousin called to check in, which really meant she wanted to see how I was holding up under the humiliation everyone assumed I was drowning in. "Richard's telling everyone you're representing yourself," she said, her voice syrupy with concern that didn't quite mask the curiosity underneath it. "Is that true?" "I have representation," I told her and left it there. She didn't ask who. I didn't offer. That became something of a pattern over the following weeks. People fishing for details and me giving them nothing to work with, which of course only fed the story Richard was so eager to tell. The less I said, the more they assumed I had nothing to say. Richard, for his part, seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. I saw it in the way he carried himself at a family barbecue 3 weeks after our coffee shop meeting, holding court by the grill with a beer in his hand, telling some story to his golf friends that ended with him glancing over at me and saying loud enough to be heard, "Some people just don't know when they're outmatched." His friends laughed. I didn't react. I've stood in rooms far more dangerous than a suburban backyard listening to men who thought their words could actually reach me. Ethan, meanwhile, had hired one of the most expensive family law firms in the state, Whitfield and Marsh, a name I recognized because they'd been featured in a regional business magazine for handling the divorce of a well-known local sports franchise owner. Richard made sure I knew the name. He made sure everyone knew the name. It was meant to be intimidating, and to most people in our circle, I imagine it was. Melissa of all people found a way to needle me, too. I ran into her once entirely by accident at a grocery store 2 towns over of all places, and instead of having the decency to look away, she smiled at me. Actually, smiled like we were old friends bumping into each other and said, "I hope you find someone decent to help you through this. It must be so hard doing this alone." I looked at her for a long moment, taking in the woman my husband had chosen to blow up 18 years of my life for, and I said, "I'm not alone, but thank you for your concern," and pushed my cart past her. She didn't know what to do with that. Neither did Richard, apparently, because word came back to me a few days later that he'd made a comment at dinner, wondering aloud what exactly I meant by that. Was I bluffing? Was I simply too proud to admit the truth? Or was there something he was missing? I let him wonder. Wondering was good for him. Wondering was frankly the least he deserved. What none of them saw, because none of them were paying attention to me the way they were paying attention to Richard's version of events, was that my life hadn't actually changed very much during those weeks. I still woke up at 5, still ran 3 miles before the sun fully cleared. The Treant still reported to base and did the work that had nothing to do with any of this training. Soldiers reviewing logistics reports, sitting through briefings that required a kind of focus that honestly was a relief compared to everything waiting for me at home. There's a strange comfort in discipline during chaos. The army teaches you that structure doesn't abandon you just because your personal life has caught fire. You put one boot in front of the other. You do the work in front of you. You trust the plan even when you can't see the whole shape of it yet. And every evening after the run, after the reports, after dinner, alone in a house that felt more like a waiting room than a home, I got a phone call. Always around 8, always brief. "How's the mood over there?" he'd ask. Confident, loud, exactly what we want. "Good. Keep it that way. Don't correct anyone. Don't confirm anything. Let them build the story they want to believe. You almost ready?" A pause and then with something that might have been the faintest trace of a smile in his voice. He said, "Cassidy, I've been ready since the day I found out what that man's father said to him. This isn't going to be close." I believed him. I'd believed him my entire life in ways that had nothing to do with this divorce and everything to do with who he'd always been to me. The person who used to walk me to the bus stop when I was 6 and he was 12. The person who sat with me in a hospital waiting room the night our mother had her first heart attack. The person who'd built an entire career on the simple stubborn belief that preparation beats arrogance every single time. 2 nights before the hearing, he called with one final instruction, delivered so calmly, it almost didn't register as significant until later. "Court's at 9, he said. "Don't get there early." "Why not?" "Because I want Richard settled in, comfortable, confident that nobody's coming." Another pause, longer this time. "Let him enjoy the quiet for a minute. It won't last." The morning of the hearing, I woke up before my alarm, the way I always do before something that matters, and I lay in bed for a few minutes, just listening to the house settle around me, thinking about how strange it was that this might be one of the last mornings I woke up in it. I put on a simple navy suit, nothing designed to make a statement, nothing borrowed or rushed for the occasion. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. Not out of vanity, but because I wanted to remember exactly what I looked like on the morning everything changed, whichever direction it went. I drove to the courthouse alone. I'd told Daniel not to arrive early, and I meant to follow my own instructions, arriving with maybe 10 minutes to spare, enough time to find the courtroom without rushing. Not enough time to sit around and let anxiety creep into my chest the way it wanted to. Richard was already there when I walked in, seated on the other side of the aisle with Ethan beside him. Both of them in tailored suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Richard's legal team surrounded them. 3 attorneys from Whitfield and Marsh, all sharp haircuts and leather portfolios, the kind of presence designed to fill a room before anyone said a single word. Richard turned when I walked in, and I watched his eyes move past me, scanning the space behind me, looking for whoever I'd supposedly hired. When he didn't see anyone, a small, satisfied smile crept across his face. The same smile from the coffee shop, except wider now, more confident, like a man watching a bet he was certain he'd already won. "I don't see your lawyer, Cassidy," he said, not quietly loud enough for the row behind us to hear, loud enough that a couple of Ethan's attorneys glanced over with something between curiosity and pity. "I did warn you." I sat down at my table alone as far as anyone in that room could tell. I set my folder down in front of me, folded my hands, and said nothing, which seemed to satisfy Richard even more than an answer would have. The clerk called the room to order. Judge Eleanor Whitman entered. I'd heard her name mentioned once or twice in passing, a judge known around the county for being unusually sharp, unusually patient, and famously unimpressed by theatrics from either side of her courtroom. She took her seat, glanced over the room, and the bailiff began reading the case number into the record. Richard leaned toward Ethan and murmured something I couldn't quite hear, but I saw the shape of his mouth, saw the satisfaction sitting comfortably on his face, and for just a moment, I let myself feel the full weight of 18 years sitting across from a man who'd never once believed I was capable of surprising him. That was when the courtroom door opened. I didn't turn around right away. I'd learned a long time ago that stillness carries its own kind of power, that the person who doesn't flinch is often the person controlling the room even when it doesn't look that way yet. But I heard the door, heard the soft, deliberate footsteps crossing the back of the courtroom, heard the particular rhythm of dress shoes that belonged to someone who walked like he owned wherever he was standing. A man in a dark charcoal suit moved down the center aisle carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the room full of eyes that had turned to watch him. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at Ethan's attorneys, even as a couple of them straightened in their seats, something flickering across their faces that looked almost like recognition. He walked straight to my table, set his portfolio down beside mine, and took the seat next to me like he'd been sitting there his whole life. Richard was still smiling. For maybe 3 more seconds, he was still smiling because he hadn't put it together yet. Hadn't connected the dots between the stranger who just sat down beside his daughter-in-law and anything that should concern him. Then the clerk read the appearances into the record, her voice flat and procedural, the way clerks recite things they've said 1,000 times before. Counsel for the petitioner Whitfield and Marsh representing Mr. Ethan Porter. Counsel for the respondent Sacrian's Sour Santa. She glanced down at her notes, then up again. Daniel Brooks, representing Mrs. Cassidy Porter. The name landed in that courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. I watched it happen in pieces, the way you watch weather change over a long horizon. First, the small crease between Richard's eyebrows, a flicker of something trying to place. A name that sounded distantly, uncomfortably familiar. Then one of Ethan's attorneys, the youngest one, leaned toward his colleague and whispered something urgent, his eyes wide. Then the older attorney beside him, actually turned fully around in his seat to look at the man sitting beside me, his expression shifting from mild curiosity into something closer to alarm. As that, I heard someone murmur 2 rows back. That's Daniel Brooks, the Daniel Brooks from the Harrove case. Richard's smile hadn't fully disappeared yet, but it had gone brittle, uncertain, a man trying to hold an expression. His face no longer believed in. He leaned over to Ethan, his voice a harsh, urgent whisper that I could just barely make out. Who was that? Ethan shook his head slightly, looking as lost as his father. Both of them staring at the man beside me like he'd materialized out of nowhere, like he hadn't been walking toward this courtroom for 18 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Daniel didn't look at either of them. He opened his portfolio, calmly arranged his papers with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times, and would do it 1,000 more, and glanced at me once briefly, with the smallest flicker of something warm in his eyes, before his expression settled back into the composed neutrality of a courtroom. Judge Whitman looked over her glasses at the room, sensing the way experienced judges always sense that something had just shifted. Mr. Brooks, she said, you may proceed with your opening statement whenever you're ready. Daniel rose to his feet, buttoned his jacket, and turned to face the room with the calm, unshakable confidence of a man who already knew exactly how this was going to end. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. I'd like to begin by addressing the financial disclosures filed by the petitioner, because I believe the court will find them significantly incomplete. Richard's face had gone the color of old paper. Daniel Brooks did not raise his voice once during the next hour, and that more than anything was what unsettled Richard the most. I'd seen my brother in professional settings, only a handful of times over the years, usually from a distance, once at a legal conference I'd attended almost by accident, when I was stationed near the city he worked in. But I had never seen him fully at work in his element, dismantling a case with the patient precision of a man taking apart a machine piece by piece to show a room exactly how it had been built to deceive them. He started with the financial disclosures. Ethan's attorneys had filed a standard asset statement weeks earlier, the kind of paperwork designed to look thorough at a glance and fall apart under any real scrutiny. Daniel walked the court through it line by line, calm and unhurried, pulling out documents that directly contradicted what had been filed under oath. Your Honor, the petitioner's disclosure lists the marital home as an asset purchased entirely through Porter Logistics, structured according to the filing as a corporate protection to shield it from division in this proceeding. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. However, bank records obtained through subpoena show that 11 personal payments totaling just over $60,000 were made directly from a joint account held by Mr. and Mrs. Porter toward the mortgage principal over the past 6 years. That is not corporate protection, Your Honor. That is a jointly maintained marital asset misrepresented as something else entirely. One of Ethan's attorneys started to object. Judge Whitman held up a hand before he'd finished the first word. Her eyes still on the documents Daniel had submitted. Over. Continue, Mr. Brooks, he continued. He moved next to the investment accounts, the ones Richard had assured me over that $8 latte, were untouchable, structured years before the marriage even began. Daniel produced transfer records showing that funds had been moved out of those accounts 3 separate times in the past 8 months. Each transfer timed within days of Ethan filing paperwork related to the divorce. Each transfer routed through a shell entity registered under Porter Logistics, but controlled according to signatory documents exclusively by Richard. This is not incidental, Daniel said, his voice never rising, never sharpening into anger, which somehow made every word land harder than if he'd shouted it. This is a pattern of asset concealment initiated by Richard Porter, executed with the direct knowledge and cooperation of his son, timed specifically to move marital property beyond the reach of this court before the petition was even filed. I watched Richard's face during all of this. He'd stopped looking smug somewhere around the second document. By the third, he'd started leaning over to his own attorneys in short, urgent bursts, and I could tell from the tight set of their jaws that they hadn't known about, at least some of what Daniel was presenting. That was, I realized, its own kind of quiet victory. Richard hadn't just been hiding things from me. He'd been hiding things from the very lawyers he'd hired, too confident to imagine anyone would ever dig deep enough to find them. Then Daniel brought up Melissa. He didn't do it cruelly. He didn't linger on the affair itself. Didn't try to humiliate anyone with salacious detail, which I appreciated more than I expected to. Instead, he focused entirely on the financial trail, a corporate credit card issued in Ethan's name through Porter Logistics used to fund an apartment lease in Melissa Grant's name, along with a series of gifts, a car lease, and a European vacation. None of it disclosed as marital spending. All of it buried in a general expense category labeled client relations. Client relations, Daniel repeated, letting the phrase sit in the air a moment dry and precise. Your Honor, I'd invite the court to review Exhibit 14, which itemizes these particular client relations expenditures totaling just under $94,000 over the past 18 months. Someone in the gallery actually laughed. A short involuntary sound quickly stifled. Judge Whitman did not smile, but something in the set of her mouth suggested she wasn't entirely unmoved by the phrasing either. Ethan's attorneys objected. They objected to the relevance to the framing, to the exhibit numbering at one point, grasping for anything that might slow the momentum building against them. Judge Whitman overruled nearly every objection, her patience for procedural stalling visibly thinning as the morning wore on. Richard, for his part, had gone entirely silent by the time Daniel introduced the text messages. A string of communications between Richard and Ethan, spanning nearly a year subpoenaed from Ethan's company-issued phone, in which Richard could be seen directly instructing his son on how to structure the transfers, which accounts to use how to word certain internal memos to avoid raising red flags with the company's own compliance department. One message read aloud by Daniel in the same even unhurried tone he'd used for everything else seemed to hit the room harder than anything before it. Richard had written 8 months earlier. Move it before she gets curious. She's smart, but she trusts you. Use that. I felt something tighten in my chest when Daniel read that one aloud. Not surprise exactly, because some part of me had always suspected Richard saw my trust as a resource to be managed rather than something that meant anything to him. But hearing it read into an official court record in his own words, in his own handwriting, was different from suspecting it privately for years. Melissa was sitting 2 rows back, and I heard her exhale sharply, then noticed her wiping quickly at her eyes. Whether from embarrassment or something closer to real feeling, I honestly couldn't say, and didn't much care to guess. Ethan wouldn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me once since Daniel had started speaking, his eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of him, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he knew better than to say out loud in a courtroom. Richard leaned toward his lead attorney and whispered something sharp, something that made the attorney's shoulders stiffen before he half rose to object to the next exhibit before it had even been introduced. Judge Whitman was losing patience with him fast, her responses growing shorter, more clipped, the particular tone of a judge who has decided which side of a case she finds credible, even if the formal ruling hasn't been spoken yet. By the time the morning session broke for a brief recess, the entire tenor of the room had shifted so completely that it hardly resembled the courtroom Richard had walked into 3 hours earlier. Smiling certain untouchable, Daniel gathered his papers with the same unhurried calm he'd maintained through the entire session, squared them neatly against the table, and turned to me for the first time since we'd sat down. You doing okay? He asked quietly just between us. I'm fine, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. He nodded, satisfied, then glanced once across the aisle at Richard, who was still deep in a tense, hissed conversation with his attorneys, refusing to meet either of our eyes. We're not done, Daniel said, turning back to me, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. There's one more witness this afternoon, someone Richard genuinely never expected to see in this room. The afternoon session resumed at 1:30, and the courtroom felt different than it had that morning. Word had clearly traveled during the recess, because the gallery had grown noticeably fuller. A handful of people I didn't recognize slipping into the back rows drawn, I assumed, by whatever version of the story had already started circulating through the courthouse hallways. Richard looked different, too. The confidence that had carried him through the morning, the easy certainty in the set of his shoulders, had thinned into something tighter, more brittle. He kept glancing toward the door every time it opened, like a man bracing for the next blow before he even knew where it was coming from. He didn't have to wait long. Daniel rose and addressed the court. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to call Mr. Gerald Finch to the stand. I watched Richard's face when the name landed, watched real, unmistakable recognition move through him, followed almost immediately by something closer to dread. I didn't know the name myself, not yet. But I understood from Richard's reaction alone, that whoever this man was, his presence in that courtroom mattered enormously. Gerald Finch turned out to be a heavy-set man in his early 60s, gray-haired, wearing a suit that looked slightly too formal for him, like he didn't often have occasion to dress this way. He walked to the stand with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who clearly did not want to be there, someone who kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look toward Richard's table even once. Daniel established the basics. First, his voice as calm and methodical as it had been all morning. Gerald Finch had served as the chief financial accountant for Porter Logistics for 19 years until his resignation 8 months earlier. He had overseen the very accounts Daniel had spent the morning walking the court through. Mr. Finch, Daniel said, can you tell the court why you resigned from Porter Logistics? Gerald shifted in his seat, glanced briefly at Richard, then away again. I was asked to structure a series of transfers that I didn't believe were legitimate business transactions. Can you elaborate, Mr. Richard Porter came to me directly on 3 separate occasions and instructed me to move funds from accounts associated with Ethan Porter's personal investments into holding entities registered under the company. He asked me to code these transfers as operational expenses. I told him I wasn't comfortable doing that without proper documentation showing legitimate business purpose. He told me. Gerald paused and for the first time looked directly at Richard, his jaw tight. He told me that my job was to do what I was told, not to ask questions about family matters. A murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Whitman's expression didn't change, but she made a note unhurried on the pad in front of her. Daniel walked Gerald through each transfer, specifically cross-referencing dates, account numbers, and the internal memos Gerald himself had eventually started keeping quietly as a kind of insurance policy once he'd realized what he was actually being asked to participate in. Why did you keep these records, Mr. Finch? Daniel asked. Because I've been in this business a long time, Gerald said. And I've learned that when a man asks you to help him hide something from his own family, sooner or later, somebody's going to come asking questions. I wanted to be able to answer them honestly when that happened. And is today the day? Yes, Gerald said quietly. It is. Ethan's attorneys tried to shake him on cross-examination, suggesting he was a disgruntled former employee, implying some kind of grudge or financial motive behind his testimony. Gerald answered each question steadily, without defensiveness, without any of the theatrics I might have expected from someone put through that kind of pressure. He simply repeated calmly that he had documentation for everything he'd said, and that documentation had already been entered into the court record that morning. By the time Gerald stepped down from the stand, Richard had stopped, even pretending to whisper instructions to his attorneys. He sat very still, staring at the table in front of him. His hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. What happened next wasn't in any transcript, wasn't part of the official proceedings, but I heard it clearly sitting close enough at our table to catch every word. Richard leaned toward Ethan, his voice low, but sharp with something that sounded like real panic, breaking through for the first time all day. You told me the accountant signed off on everything, Richard hissed. You told me this was clean. I told you what you wanted to hear. Ethan snapped back, quiet but furious, because you never once asked me if it was actually legal. You just told me to do it. I was protecting this family. You were protecting yourself, Ethan said, and something in his voice cracked slightly. 18 years of deferring to his father, finally splitting open in the worst possible place to have it happen. You've always just been protecting yourself, and you made me complicit in it. Richard turned away from him, his jaw working, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something on his face that looked almost like fear. Not fear of losing money. Richard had weathered financial setbacks before, and always emerged fine. This looked like something closer to the fear of finally being seen clearly after decades of controlling exactly how people were allowed to see him. Melissa had already slipped out during Gerald's testimony, and I noticed her seat remained empty for the rest of the afternoon. I sat quietly, through all of it, watching 2 men who had spent months underestimating me now turn on each other in a room full of strangers. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that. Something closer to relief, the particular relief of finally watching the truth stand up in a room where for years only Richard's version of things had ever been allowed to exist. Daniel returned to our table and sat down beside me, his expression composed, but his eyes carrying the faintest trace of something satisfied underneath the professionalism. "That's the case," he said quietly. "Richard just ran out of people willing to lie for him." I nodded, watching Richard across the aisle, watching a man who had built his entire identity on being untouchable finally understand in real time exactly how much he was about to lose. The courtroom reconvened after a short recess for Judge Whitman's ruling. And I remember thinking as I sat there waiting, how strange it was that after everything, after 18 years, after months of quiet preparation, the ending would arrive in a room this ordinary, under fluorescent lights, with a court reporter typing steadily in the corner like this was any other Tuesday. Judge Whitman didn't waste time with theatrics. She spoke plainly, methodically the way I imagined she'd spoken thousands of times before in that same chair, though I doubt many of those rulings carried quite this much weight for the people sitting in front of her. She found based on the evidence presented that Ethan Porter had knowingly participated in the concealment of marital assets in direct violation of financial disclosure requirements with the active direction and assistance of his father Richard Porter. She ordered a full and equal division of all marital property, including the home, the investment accounts that had been improperly transferred, and additional compensation to account for the funds diverted toward what the court's written order dryly referred to as undisclosed personal expenditures. She further ordered that Ethan bear the full cost of my legal fees, citing the deliberate and bad faith nature of the concealment as grounds for the award. Richard sat frozen through the entire reading, his face pale, his eyes fixed on some point on the table in front of him that I don't think he was actually seeing anymore. When the judge finished and the room began to empty, I stood, gathered my things, and walked out with Daniel beside me, past rows of people who just that morning had watched me walk in with nothing and no one at my side. Richard caught up to us on the courthouse steps outside alone, his attorneys trailing several paces behind, giving him space for whatever this was about to be. He looked older out there in the daylight, smaller somehow than he'd ever seemed across a dinner table. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never once heard from him. "Why didn't you tell any of us who he was?" I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about coffee shops and Thanksgiving dinners and every quiet insult I'd swallowed for 18 years. And I found myself smiling, not out of cruelty, but because the answer had been sitting right there the whole time, waiting for exactly this moment. "You're right," I said. "I really couldn't afford a lawyer like him." Richard blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "I didn't have to," I continued. "Because he didn't charge me a dime." "Why not?" Richard asked, and I could hear underneath the question a man finally beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd misjudged the person standing in front of him. Daniel stepped up beside me and rested a hand lightly on my shoulder, his voice, calm, almost gentle the way it might sound coming from someone who'd waited a long time to finally say this out loud in front of the man who'd spent years underestimating his sister. "Because she's my little sister," he said simply. "And family doesn't send family a bill." Richard didn't say anything after that. There wasn't really anything left to say. He stood there on those courthouse steps, the autumn light falling across a face that had built itself for decades on the assumption that money was the only currency that mattered in this world. Finally understanding that some things, loyalty, patience, the quiet strength of a person he'd never bothered to really see, couldn't be bought, couldn't be predicted, and couldn't be beaten by a legal team, no matter how expensive. Ethan stood a few steps behind his father, saying nothing at all. His eyes finally meeting mine for just a moment before he looked away, whatever he might have wanted to say. Clearly, too small for the size of what he'd done. I walked down those steps with my brother beside me out into an ordinary afternoon, cars moving past on the street like nothing extraordinary had just happened. And I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not victory exactly, something quieter and more permanent than that. The particular hard-won piece of a person who had finally stopped shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's idea of who she was allowed to be. I think about that day often. And what I've come to understand is this. The people who underestimate you rarely do it because you've given them a reason to. They do it because it's easier for them to believe the smaller version of you. The version that doesn't threaten the story they've built about themselves. You don't owe anyone a preview of your strength. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply let them find out if this story meant something to you. If any part of it reminded you of your own quiet strength or a moment when someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong in your own time. I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. It always means more than you know to hear from you. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about family, about justice, about the quiet kind of courage that doesn't need an audience to be real, make sure you're subscribed because we've got so many more of these journeys waiting to be told together. Thank you for walking through this one.